This is going to be my first lecture in English. I don't know how it's going to work out. Can you hear me? I can't hear me. Can you hear myself? Strange. When I was invited to do this, it was about, I don't know, 6 or 4 months ago. And at that time, I said, oh yeah, it's a long time, I'm going to do it. Meanwhile, I had to do it. And it improved my English, I hope. After having done the preparation, I feel sort of glad because I had the opportunity to actually see what I'm doing and what my colleagues over there in Switzerland are doing. So what I did is I sort of like composed, maybe that's too big a word. I wrote down 16 small chapters of words which are going to be combined with images. And I think of them as sort of like kaleidoscopes of the things I think about architecture or about my architecture. So these chapters do not have any particular succession. They could be changed around in any way. I think only as a whole they could maybe bring up or show you what I think. There's another thing, there are not too many slides, and it might as well be that you get to know what I think, and that you still think, well, I don't know the buildings, but I can assure you these buildings, they're there, and you can go and look at them anytime. I have had this kind of problem of having had lectures in Switzerland and so on. I have had this problem of explaining these buildings with slides from back and from the front and from the bottom and from the top. And I found it, I don't know, I'm sort of, actually I got sick and tired of this kind of explaining the things, but you'll see, I guess, together with the words, you'll get at least an image and a mood of what the whole thing is all about. So I'm going to read these small chapters. It shouldn't take too long. When I think of architecture, images arise and fill my mind. Most of these images are related to my training and work as an architect. They contain the amount of intellectual understanding about architecture I was able to accumulate over the years. There was a time in my life when I experienced architecture without thinking about it. I remember the feeling of the door handle when I entered my aunt's garden as a boy. This piece of metal, shaped like the back of a spoon, was like a particular welcome into a world of various sounds and smells. Walking on the gravel, walking up the polished wooden stairs, hearing the heavy mass of the front door, falling back into the lock behind me, leaving the dim hallway and entering the kitchen, the only brightly lit room in the house. Only here the room had a ceiling, I remember now, and the tiled floor felt hard and awkward. And there was this smell of oil paint coming from the cupboard. Everything was the way it is in a kitchen. There was nothing special about it. But maybe just because of that, there was this special atmosphere I cannot forget. Now I feel talking and telling you about all the door handles which came after that handle of my aunt's garden, and about floors of cobblestones covered with the leaves of chestnut trees in the autumn, and about all those doors shutting in a particular way, smooth, decent, rich and full in sound, thin and cheap, hard and nasty, bold and intimidating. Memories like those are our most deeply rooted architectural experiences, I believe. For me, they provide a basic vocabulary of how architecture can feel, sound, and smell. Thus, while designing a building, I find myself digging into old and half-forgotten experience. How were those architectural settings actually composed? What did they mean to me then? What could help me to compose this rich atmosphere where everything is saturated with self-evidence and just seems to belong there, and there will be no predominating design shapes anywhere to be seen, and there's still this particular air of richness, and you think, I have seen this before, while at the same time, you know, everything is different, and there are no direct quotations of anything old to be tracked down. There is something revealing for me in the works of Joseph Beuys and the artists of the Arte Povera group, like Mario Merz. It is the sensual and precise use of materials. It seems to look back at an old cultural knowledge of what materials are, and at the same time bring forth the very nature of materials, free from any cultural meaning. In the work of those artists, material takes on this particular meaning which can only be explained by the work itself. It is the work of art which makes us see the meaning of materials in a new way. In architecture, I find it important to make use of materials in much the same way. If materials in architecture do have poetic qualities, which I believe they do, then they will reveal themselves only within the context of the architectural object. That context goes beyond formal aspects like contrasts and juxtapositions, and sound, smell, and tactile values of materials are merely part of the language we have to speak in. The aim is to generate a specific meaning which is stimulated by the object as we experience it. For that, we have to reinvestigate the traditional use of building materials and make it correspond to our imagination of what materials could mean in a particular context today. Subtle alterations, as well as strict conversions of traditions which are found to be dull, can be the means of that redefinition. If we succeed in that, materials are brought to emanate and resonate in a new way, and they seem to tell us something about what they really are. One of the striking things about the music of Johann Sebastian Bach is its architecture. One is able to hear the different elements of the musical melody, harmony, and rhythm in detail and transparency, while at the same time one remains completely aware of the composition as a whole in which everything is encompassed. You can feel that there is a clear structure underlying the whole, and if you follow the threads of the musical texture, it is possible to begin to understand it. Buildings are an extension of the human capacity to construct. Construction is the art of creating a whole out of many different parts. I believe that construction is the very core of the architectural task. Construction is about concrete materials and the way they are put together. It's right there that architecture becomes part of the real world. As an architect, I feel respect for craftsmanship and engineering. Those disciplines are a repository of our cultural knowledge They contain the information about how artifacts can be made. Architecture cannot solve the problem of how the production of things also rapidly becomes alien to the very people who are directly involved in it. In my work, though, I try to resist those tendencies. Structures, construction, and manufacturing are important to me. I believe these disciplines have their own virtues, with which every new building has to be challenged and enhanced. The work we put into things stays there and speaks for us, according to a German saying. Sometimes when I encounter a piece of music, literature, or a painting which succeeds in getting to me, I'm inclined to think that is true. I like music. Slow movements of Mozart's piano concertos, John Coltrane's ballads, or the folk music of the lower Engadine Valley, you weren't able to hear enough, loud enough just now, touch me. The human capacity to invent melody, harmony, and rhythm continues to astonish me deeply. Yet the world of sound also encompasses the opposites of melody, harmony, and rhythm. There is disharmony and broken rhythm. There are fragments and clusters of sound. And there is purely functional sound we call noise. Contemporary music works with these elements. I like to think that contemporary architecture should have the same radical approach towards its subject matter that contemporary music does. But there are limits to this comparison, I think. If disharmony, isolation of parts, absence of rhythm, clustering, disruption of structure become essential components of a building, that building can convey powerful messages. But after the comprehension of the message, the desire dissolves. Architecture has its own realm. Architecture is related to life in a direct and specific way. Rather than being a message itself, it provides a sensible encasement for life to take place. For the rhythm of steps on the floor, for the concentration of work, for the silence of sleep. Built architecture belongs to a specific site in the concrete world. It is there that architectural object has its natural presence and speaks about itself. Representations of architecture reflect that fact in a special way. They try to depict the qualities of the architectural object in its specific setting as precisely as possible. Yet the very effort of representation can stimulate a distinct feeling of the absence of the real object. At this point comes an awareness of the basic insufficiency of any representation. Our curiosity to experience the represented reality might be stirred, and also our desire if the qualities of the promised reality touch us. If the realism or artificiality of an architectural drawing or model becomes too overwhelming, and the representation doesn't contain something like permeable spots which allow for our imagination to enter and our curiosity about reality to flare up, then the representation itself becomes the object of our desire. The representation doesn't make any promises anymore. then it means itself. I like drawings which reach out for reality of the object. I try to develop my representations up to the point where they begin to stimulate the first traces of reality and mood the object is conceived to assume. For this, the drawing itself has to take on essential qualities of the object in search. Alienation between the representation and the actual thing it represents is to be avoided. There should be no diversion caused by graphics which consider the representation only. Thus, the drawings show the essence of an idea just realistically enough to stimulate real experience, and just abstractly and openly enough to allow for imagination to penetrate the aura of the world which is represented. Then I can step back and look, feel, understand, and prove what I see. Artifacts are made out of different pieces which have to be joined together. For the quality of the object, the join is crucial. In sculpture, there exists a tradition of minimizing the expression of the connection of different pieces so as not to compromise the expression of the whole. Richard Serra's steel objects appear just as homogeneous as older sculptures made out of stone or wood. Other artists of the 60s and 70s used the most basic and self-evident joins for their constructions. Joseph Beuys or Mario Merz worked frequently with loose settings, wrapping, folding, stacking, in order to establish the equilibrium of composition. The straightforward and self-evident way those sculptural objects are put together is striking to me. There are no diversions of forms and meanings in small parts. Every connection, every join is just there to function for the overall idea and thus to enforce the presence of the whole. If architecture is to arrive at a strong presence of its objects, it has to elaborate on a similar order of composition on its own premises, I think. Architecture has to deal with a considerable functional and structural complexity. It has to generate detailed constructions and forms for the edges and corners where the various planes and materials converge. And it is challenged to incorporate elements which vary in function, material, form, and size. To design architectural details means to establish the correct hierarchy among the different parts of a building. Details also provide for intermediate proportions and a sense of scale. According to the overall idea of the object, the details express separation, application, coherence, looseness, tension, tightness, homogeneity, solidness. Living up to those demands means trying to create an architectural body which doesn't allow for the question of decoration and the feeling of distraction. This is because you see this fully developed architectural physiognomy. There is a magical power in every self-contained artificial arrangement. Only now you see a detail and you keep looking back at it. These two nails on the floor which hold the steel sheets next to the battered bar of the sill. Images arise. Something is touching you. Everything goes. Main Street is almost all right. Nothing goes anymore. These statements indicate contradictory opinions. Maybe they indicate contradictory facts. We seem to get used to living with such contradiction. We also know why. Cultural traditions dissolve, there's no real identity anymore. Economy and politics develop dynamics no one seems able to understand or handle. Everything intermingles, and mass communication creates this strange artificial world of science. Maybe this is postmodern life. Everything beyond our personal biographical facts is vague, blurred, and somehow unreal. The world is full of isolated signs which make allusions to things nobody really gets to understand because they turn out to be illusions themselves. The real thing is hiding. Nobody ever gets to see it. I believe there are still real things. There is earth, water, the light of the sun, vegetation, and there are artifacts like engines, tools, or musical instruments, which just are what they are. They don't carry artificial messages. They have a self-evident presence. There is a particular strength within the things of ordinary life. The paintings of Edward Hopper seem to say, you only have to look long enough to see it. In the perception of an artifact which is freed of any meaning, unrelated to its very nature, there appears, I believe, a void, an emptiness. The perception becomes silent, unpremeditated, and non-possessive. It lies beyond the order of signs and symbols. It focuses precisely on the object, but the meaning of the object somehow stays obtuse. It is like holding a thing which cannot be put in the center of awareness. No matter, it's like looking at a thing. No matter how much you try to focus. In that void of perception and silence, there is now room for an old cultural knowledge about the object to surface within the perceiver. Then, seeing the object is also seeing the world in its entirety, because there is nothing there to not understand. There is something mysterious, I think, about the presence of certain buildings. They seem to just be there. You don't notice them in any particular way. Yet it is impossible to imagine the place where they stand without them. Those buildings seem to be firmly connected to the ground. They seem to be part of their physical surroundings as a matter of course, and they seem to say, I am the way you see me, and I belong here. To make buildings which have that same self-evident presence is my greatest desire, I admit that. I believe that each building should be inserted into its site and history in such a way that it appears as a completion of a landscape which wasn't finished before. Good buildings reflect their context in a broad way. The broader the context we can assign to it, the better the building, I believe. The essence of that context is this specific sense of the now which comes from the before. Therefore, the context we create for a building has to respect the various ways we remember things. The remembered is not compatible with the final point at the end of a line John Berger says in his book about looking. There are various possibilities which lead to the remembrance and converge in it. Words, comparisons, and signs have to provide a context for understanding. There is a radial system of approach to be installed around the object, which allows us to see it simultaneously in various ways, personally, culturally, historically, aesthetically, functionally, commonly, passionately. Of all the drawings architects produce, I think working drawings are the most interesting. Working drawings are the explicit and precise. They are free of this desire to persuade somebody of an architectural vision of an object which isn't quite worked out yet, as we know from drawings made at earlier stages. Working drawings are full of certainty and confidence. They seem to say, this is exactly the way it's going to be. Working drawings resemble anatomical drawings. They show something of the secret which the fully assembled architectural body does not reveal anymore. The art of construction, hidden geometries, the friction and mutual charge of materials, the inner forces of bearing and bracing, the human work which is being put into things. For the penultimate documenta at Kassel, Per Kirkeby, the Danish sculptor, built this brick sculpture shaped like a house. There was no entrance to that house. The inside was totally inaccessible. It remained a secret which, together with the structural elements, gave to the object a mysterious depth and an air of animation. I believe that hidden architectural structures can be arranged so as to set the object as a whole into a state of contained tension. Violins are like that. They let us think of the objects in nature. At a time in my life, I had this premature idea that poetry was a composition of metaphorical images insinuated by words which form a cloud of vague meanings left up to personal interpretation. As an architect, I learned that poetry must go beyond that. Looking for poetic qualities in architecture can only mean the search for the specific meaning of things which cannot be alienated from the thing themselves. Thus, art is not about interesting configurations and vague illusions, but I guess it is about truth, and poetry is about unexpected truth. It might arise when we patiently strive for the essence of our work, and its emergence needs silence, I believe. For the object itself is never poetic. It merely has these delicate qualities which at a particular moment make us understand something we never knew like that before. Those moments are rare. So I think architecture is about preparing that realm of silence. To be objective and rational while designing a building is a method of creating order. To be subjective about generating the real body of the object is like admitting to the fact that one has highly personal feelings towards architecture. The writings of architects, as you all know, often do not correspond to their actual work, because they write only about their rational aspects and show little of the passion which keeps them working in certain ways. But you can see all of that in their buildings, which I think are usually better than their writings. In my experience, the process of designing is a continuous interaction of thought and emotion. I try to understand my feelings about form, materials, and space. But at the beginning and at the end, I only trust my emotions. There are these rare moments where this precious sharpness flares up. All of a sudden I feel that I am under the influence of some strange drug. I feel passion and joy, provoked by an image, the stroke of a pencil. There's a new quality to everything I know about the object so far. At this moment, the image of the object becomes the object of my desire. These, I think, are the moments that count. Geometry is abstract thinking about space. Applied geometry helps us to understand how to capture space in architecture. The applied geometry I'm thinking of deals with simple planes describing certain voids connected to the infinite space, as well as with solid or closed objects which are subtracted from infinite space. Exploring these basic possibilities of spatial organization in architecture means developing a grammar and syntax of the intervention into space. I don't claim to know what space is all about. The more I think about it, the more mysterious it becomes to me. One thing is clear to me though. Dealing with space in architecture is like dealing with one end of the subject matter only. Because what only architecture can do is make the small physical things on earth appear to vibrate in the larger, inconceivable infinity called space. With that image in mind, I like to look at the small-scale plans and sections of my buildings as simple and essential diagrams of mere spatial organization. I picture my buildings as precise objects in space. I try to treat the amount of space a single object contains so as to stimulate an awareness of the infinite space which surrounds it. Thus the walls of the building assume the character of membranes which, as in a musical instrument, must be built to vibrate freely so as to allow for a clear sound. Architecture is about invention. When we went to school, we tried to live up to that. We were inventive and strove for the avant-garde. Only later was I to find out really that most of the essential issues of architecture had already been addressed or worked on by other architects. Now, looking back, that school situation appears to me like sitting in a monochromatic box and reinventing that which has already been invented without knowing it. I have no problem assigning didactic value to such a situation while in school. Yet, as an architect, it makes sense to rely upon the great body of former achievements contained in the tradition of architecture. As I look into it, I'm always amazed about what there is to be explored and learned from. Yet again, judging from experience, I must state clearly in the process of designing a building, I always reach this point of despair which immediately changes to wild anger and self-confidence. These are the moments when I try to forget about all architectural knowledge and free myself of any preconceived ideas, because nothing that I know seems to match what I desire to design. Every architectural object is a unique commentary on what exists. It is a commentary on site specificity as well as on the very nature of the purpose of the building. Furthermore, I see it also as a commentary on the history of architecture and on the trends of our time. In order to generate that commentary, the architect has to ask bold and critical questions. The answers to those questions, which I give in my buildings, are bound to be limited. This time of blurred meanings and dissolving identities doesn't allow for big gestures. There's little to rely upon, but within my buildings I can try to give a reasonable and thoughtful answer. I can reassert and enhance what I find to have virtues, and I can correct and redefine that which is disturbing and wrong. Thus the building should stand there and help us to understand itself, the site and the time in which it was built in a way that you not could understand before. Ettore Scola's film, Le Bal, shows this dance hall where all the action takes place. There is no spoken dialogue, only music and people, and no scene changes. It's always that same dance hall where the same people come to dance, where time goes by and the dancers grow older. The film focuses on the people, but it is this dance hall with its tiled floor, its paneling, those stairs at the back, and the lion's paw on the side, which provide the strange atmosphere of the film? Or is it the people who provide the ambience of that room? I'm posing this question here because I do believe that a good building must be able to absorb traces of life, and in so doing take on a particular richness. Of course, I'm talking about the patina of age, the countless small scars on the surfaces, the lost brilliance of the lacquer work and the spots polished by time and use. But if I close my eyes and try to subtract all of these physical traces and first emotions, something, an awareness of time and life remains. Aesthetic or functional values have become secondary. The stylistic or historical appearance of the architecture is of no concern at all. What counts is only this grip of melancholy emotion. Architecture is exposed to life. If its body is sensitive enough, it can develop a richness which reassures the reality of the past. In order to invent a building, I like to rely on images of an architectural nature and mood. The images I produced in my mind hold my biographical and cultural knowledge. In the process of designing my object, I have to find out what they mean to me and how they would work as a form and mood generating components of the object I'm looking for. At a certain point, the object takes on the qualities of those preconceived images. If I do my work well, the superimposition of those qualities can stimulate an aura of intense richness. For that, it is essential that the superimposed qualities are not alien to the specific nature of the object. They must relate to its purpose and structure in a direct way. This structure and function on the one side cannot be separated anyway. Thus, structure and function on one side cannot not be separated anymore from the appearance of the forms and the qualities of mood on the other side. They are inseparably related to each other by reason and meaning, and they form a whole. Now, the analytical perception wanders back and forth. The synthesis of the whole allows no easy access for the analytical thought. Everything seems to refer to everything. At this moment, the awareness of the precarious process of design and the considerations used to form the whole dissolve. The image of the beginning seemed now like steps left behind. Metaphors and anecdotes are not important anymore. The object stays in focus. I like architecture to be itself and not a metaphor of symbol of something else. In a time which celebrates the non-essential, I think architecture should speak its very own language. That language is not a language of stylistic elements. Every building is built for a specific purpose, for a specific site in a specific society. The language in which architecture speaks has to be directly related to those simple truths and to accept the challenge they represent. If we develop that language with critical thought, then we can resist the selling out of forms and meanings and maybe plead a little with our buildings for spirit and reason. Those were these chapters. You have seen images of the artists Hopper, photographer Strand, Judd, Beuys, Andres. You have seen of my buildings, my own studio in Haldenstein, Canton of Grisons, Switzerland, a protection shelter for Roman ruins, and the chapel for the Saint Benedict, which was inaugurated a couple of months ago. There was also a competition project for Zurich we made, to sort of a fill-in the old city, the medieval part of Zurich. Those were the drawings. And at the beginning you saw the house where all these people who have the same name, second name than I do come from. Thank you for your attention. I must admit to you that reading these things here I just read, it's sort of, sometimes I feel it's like too personal, if you know what I mean. I'm not that serious a guy.